So, blood sugars. Living with diabetes, it can sometimes feel like that's all our world evolves around. But how do we achieve those dreamy blood sugars? Let's talk about it, and I'll show you the 5 things that I do to achieve the best blood sugars for me. I'm Christelle from Diabetes Strong, and I have been living with type 1 diabetes since 1997. That's 27 years now of being in charge of managing my own blood sugars. That's over 9,900 days. Oh boy. I generally aim for a blood sugar of around 100 milligrams per deciliter. But of course, like anyone else living with diabetes, I will see fluctuations in my blood sugars throughout the day. And looking at my 30-day average, I'm pretty close. This is data from my CGM, so my continuous glucose monitor, that shows my blood sugars 24/7. Looking at the last 2 days, I'm even closer. And remember, I'm talking averages here. But does this mean that we should all aim for an average of 100 or higher or lower? Well, no, not really. I'm a huge believer in individualized care, and I hope your doctor is as well. So a great first step is to discuss your target with your medical team. But let's get into how you achieve your dream blood sugars. What you need, and this is going to be bare minimum, you can't do this without it, you'll need a blood glucose meter, some people just call it a meter or glucometer, or you need a CGM. And this is the only way you'll know your glucose levels. You can get fairly reasonable priced meters without a prescription at most pharmacies, or you can reach out to your insurance and ask about coverage. This tiny meter is from CVS, my local pharmacy, and it's around $20 and strips are around 33 cents per strip depending on how many you buy. Okay, let's get practical. Are you ready? The first and one of the most efficient things that I do to keep my blood sugars where I want them is super low tech. And that is to use a blood sugar logbook. The thing is, if you do not get a good understanding of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis and how it's impacting your blood sugars, you're pretty much in the dark. So as a minimum, I write down my blood sugar levels before and after meals, as well as food and medication. And often I also write down my fasting as well as my bedtime blood sugars. This makes it super easy for me to go back, see, well, what worked and what changes I might want to make. Many doctors will suggest that you keep a journal, and this is pretty much what they mean. They can then go over that journal with you and help assess if you should be making any changes. Having a good, solid logging routine is going to be the backbone for you achieving the blood sugars that you're hoping for. Next, we'll talk about what details to log and what to do with that information, but this has to be the starting point. You can grab any random piece of paper and a pen, or you can use something like my logbook. Yes, I made this. I designed it so that you can track the most important details, and you can find it on Amazon. You'll also see other options on Amazon. I just think most of them miss the mark. Actually, before we get to my second tip, let's just briefly talk a little bit more about blood sugar targets. Remember my average 30-day blood sugar of 116? Well, that's actually fairly on par with an average non-diabetic blood sugars. Those are generally below 117. You might find an average of 117, 116 totally unacceptable. You might want to be below 100 at all times. That's okay. That is why individualized care is so important. So if you and your medical team have decided that you should aim for an average of 100 or maybe even 80, and that's working for you, cool. I'm all for it. And the next 4 tips that I'm going to be talking about can help you get there. One of the reasons why I'm fairly happy with an average of 116, also sometimes my averages are higher, say 125, I'm also happy with that. One of the reasons is that the general recommendation is that otherwise healthy people living with diabetes should aim for an average blood sugar of 140 milligrams per deciliter or lower, which translates to an A1C of 6.5% or lower. The American Diabetes Association, so the ADA, also recommends that. So in general, people with diabetes should target a fasting blood sugar level of 80 to 130 milligrams per deciliter. Let's do that in millimole as well. That's 4.4 to 7.2 millimole. And aim to keep their after meal blood sugar levels below 180 milligrams per deciliter. In millimole, that's 10. Something to think about is that lower is not always better. So if you manage with insulin like I do, you might see your blood sugars dip down to 70 or below at certain times. And it might be tempting to let your blood sugars run on the lower side, maybe below 70, to keep your averages down as well as your A1C. Don't do it. I've fallen into that trap in the past, and I was constantly exhausted and not quite there. So when our blood sugars fall down below 70, we start to lose cognitive function. I do not recommend that. Aside from tracking my blood sugars and as well as my meds, I like to, at least for a dedicated period of time, to also track what impacts blood sugars the most aggressively, and that is carbohydrates, also known as carbs. So what I do is I count carbs. What that means is that I calculate how many carbohydrates are in my meals or in anything I eat or drink. This sounds like a lot of work, but I promise you there's actually no math involved. I do not count carbs for every meal or all the time. I'll count carbs if I'm in doubt of how many carbohydrates are in a meal or if I want to make changes to my blood sugars. I use carb counting for insulin dosing, but even if you do not use insulin, I still think it makes sense for you to count your carbs, even if you're only doing it occasionally. It can help you figure out how many carbs you can tolerate in one sitting. Or maybe a doctor has given you a set amount of carbs for each meal. Well, counting your carbs can help you assess if you're actually hitting that target. So I promised no math, and that is because I use the free version of something called MyFitnessPal to calculate my carbs for me. You can either use the app or you can go to www.myfitnesspal.com. For it to be accurate though, it does require you to measure out your food or to pay really good attention to serving sizes. I measure my food using a kitchen scale, and then I look up the carb count in MyFitnessPal. Pro tip here, if you add more than one food to a meal, you can flip your phone horizontally and it will do the complete carb count for you. As I promised, no math. So I write down what my blood sugar was before that meal, what I ate, as well as a carb count. And then I'll also add if I took any insulin with that meal, which for the most part I will. And then the final piece of information is what was my blood sugars 1.5 to 2 hours after that meal. If my blood sugar is not where I want it after that 1.5 to 2 hours, I will make changes. I can make changes to the meal size, my insulin dose, or my insulin timing. More on timing a little later. The reason why I focus on 1.5 hours to 2 hours after the meal is because at this time, any blood sugar spikes should be out of the system and blood sugars should be back in range. Remember how the ADA recommends that your blood sugar should be back below 180 after that 1.5 to 2 hours? Well, that's a little high to me. I would like it to be below 140 and preferably closer to 100, which just happens to be what quote unquote normal non-diabetic blood sugars usually are. Did you notice that when I introduced tip number 2, I said that carbs are the type of food that's going to hit the blood sugars the most aggressively? Well, then you might also have deduced that there are also other types of food that can impact your blood sugars. And not only that, also what you choose to eat with your carbs can change how aggressively that's going to hit your bloodstream. So tip number 3 is to not just look at carbs, but to look at the full meal composition, or said differently, look at all the nutrients that are on your plate. When it comes to macronutrients, we have carbohydrates, we have proteins, and we have fats. And here's the kicker. Let's say that you only eat protein, you skip the carbs, you eat a big omelet. Well, you might actually see a significant impact on your blood sugars, as protein also get converted into energy. And for example, adding high fat, high protein, or high fiber foods to your carbohydrates can actually blunt the blood sugar impact. So there's a lot to think about here. I can't tell you what exactly to put on your plate. We're all different. Plus, I'm not a registered dietitian. But I think it's important to know that we all react differently to different types of foods, to meal compositions, and different quantities. So the key here is to continue to take notes and pay attention to how different types of food, different food compositions, different serving sizes are impacting your blood sugars, so that you'll figure out what works for you and what does not. If I see my blood sugars shoot up or maybe even stay up after a meal, my first step is not to just cut that out. If this is something I enjoy, I'll pay attention and see if this is a consistent trend. So do I consistently see my blood sugar shoot up after this meal? If that is the case, again, if it's something I enjoy, something I want to continue eating, my first step is to look at the portion size and then see if I can maybe make some changes to that meal. I mentioned that high fat, high protein, high fiber foods has the potential of blunting the blood sugar impact. The reason for this, and this is very high level, a little simplified, is that these types of food slows down digestion, and that's why you won't see as much of a blood sugar spike. So the solution to the blood sugar problem I just mentioned with that one meal might be to add a source of fiber, protein, or fats. For example, adding some macadamia nuts, some avocado, or some chicken. Before we move on to the next tip, I want to show you something. I figured since you're still watching this video, you're probably enjoying it. Awesome. Thank you for watching. And I want to invite you to become a member of the Diabetes Strong YouTube community. You can find it here at the top of the page. When you click on it, you can hear my little sales pitch. Let's not do that right now. Membership is $2.99 a month. And with that, you get access to the monthly Q&A. That video is only posted to the Diabetes Strong YouTube community. You also get priority answers to any of your questions. You get early access to my videos. You get a little membership icon. And you get a thank you from me. Now, let's get back to those blood sugar lowering tips. What we eat and drink are not the only things that can impact blood sugars. So it's also worth to think about some of all of the other factors that can impact your blood sugars and what you can do about it. There are upwards of 42 things that can impact blood sugars, and many have nothing to do with what we eat. This is partially one of the reasons why I'm really happy with an average blood sugar of 116, because all of these things, I can't control all of that. I see our bodies as a little bit of a black box. There's a lot of things that we can't control. So what I choose to do is I focus on what I can control, I do my best, and I do accept a certain margin of error. But learning to pay attention and starting to learn what impacts your blood sugars the most can really help you in reaching your blood sugar goal. And some of these 42 things we can actually do something about. Take something like number 24 here, the dawn phenomena. It's a biological response. In the early hours, the body will be releasing glucose into the bloodstream, getting you ready for the day. There's a similar response some call feet on the floor, which is the blood sugar increase you might see right when you wake up and put those feet on the floor. Well, if you have no insulin production or limited insulin production, this can mean that your blood sugars start to shoot up in the morning. If you use insulin to manage your blood sugars, your doctor might suggest that you increase your long-acting insulin, so your background insulin. If you use metformin, maybe your dose will be altered, reducing the carbs at night, or as soon as you wake up, eating breakfast, eating a meal that includes carbs might do the trick. Eating something when you're seeing your blood sugar shoot up might seem counterintuitive, but insulin shuts off the liver glucose output. So eating something, forcing your body to counter it with insulin or injecting insulin might actually do the trick. The more we know, right? So continue taking notes. And when you start seeing patterns, you can start making plans for making data-driven changes to your blood sugars. As we continue to learn how our body reacts to different things, and again, you do that by writing things down so that you understand not just in general terms, but specifically for you, how you and your body is reacting to different foods, different external factors, biological factors, all of it. There's still one more component that we need to discuss, and that is blood sugar lowering meds. Because we might also need to adjust our blood sugar lowering meds or maybe the timing of them. Most people work with a medical team to adjust their blood sugar lowering meds. If that's you, of course you should continue to do that. It's also not recommended that you make any changes on your own before you've discussed it with your team. I use a long-acting insulin as well as a rapid-acting insulin. So that's a mealtime insulin, and I'm completely self-managed. That means that I make adjustments and dosing decisions daily by myself. So a little bit more about insulin here and how I do it. So in my experience, making changes to how much insulin I take for my meals is probably one of the most important things that I do in order to achieve the blood sugars that I do. And I do that by using something called a carb ratio. A carb ratio tells you how many grams of carbs does 1 unit of rapid-acting insulin cover. So my lunch carb ratio is around 10, but it differs throughout the day because my insulin sensitivity differs throughout the day, and most likely so does yours. So with a carb ratio of 10, if I'm eating 20 grams of carbs, I'll need 2 units of rapid-acting insulin. 20 grams of carbs divided by 10. See how that carb counting is coming in handy again? To not drag this video out super long, I'm only focusing on carbohydrates here. But if, for example, you're eating a very low carb diet, you probably want to get your head around how to dose for fats and proteins pretty quickly. But one thing is the total dose, the other thing is the timing. Again, talking about mealtime insulin such as Novolog or Humalog, so rapid-acting insulins, they don't start to work right away. Once injected, it takes about 15 minutes before they even hit the bloodstream, and they're not at their most effective until an hour to an hour and a half after injected, and most stay in the body for around 4 hours. So if you inject your insulin right as you're about to start to eat or even after, you might see your blood sugar shoot up as the insulin hasn't had time to start working yet. And this is why it's recommended to do something called a pre-bolus, which pretty much just means injecting your insulin 10 to 15 minutes before you start your meal. There are some other mealtime insulins that work way faster, but that's a topic for another video. If you do not take insulin, but maybe use metformin or semaglutide like Ozempic or Rybelsus, you should not be making changes on your own. But laying the groundwork that we've discussed in this video, writing things down, figuring what works for you, what does not work for you, means that you and your medical team can make the changes needed to your care so that you can achieve the blood sugars that you're hoping for. These are very hands-on tips for blood sugar management. It's day-to-day. If we look a little bit broader strokes, most people can also benefit from adding more movement to their routine, maintaining a healthy weight, hydrating, and getting enough sleep. But I wanted this video to be a little bit more practical, day to day. But if you're interested in a lot more ideas and information, I suggest that you check out this video where I go over 19 things that you can do to lower your A1C. And while you do that, why not subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications? That way, you'll never miss a thing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.